Hello, everyone. This is Maya with a short lecture for you on tour merchandising and retail merchandising for music artists. Let's jump right in with the first slide. And if you have any questions at all, feel free to place them in the comments. So let's talk about tour merchandising. This is actually still a good source of revenue for touring artists. As we know, record sales, and especially something like a physical CD sale at the back of the room, just really doesn't happen much anymore. And so when we talk about tour merchandising, it is an important stream of income for the music industry. Let's get into what it's like to sell merchandise on tour. So what is tour merchandise? Well, it's just like what it sounds like it is. It's merchandise that you sell when you're on tour. I'm sure a lot of you have purchased merchandise before at a show, at a festival, a concert. We oftentimes internalize the bands and the type of music that we like as part of our identity. And tour merchandise is one way to show I've been there. And so it is a very personal and important experience for a lot of the fans that may come and see your live performances. Let's talk a little bit more about how merchandisers work, and in the larger music careers, this is sort of a middleman that comes between the creation of the items, the selling of the items, and the money flow for the artist and the venue. So let's talk merchandisers. They would be known as one of the intermediaries in the music industry. And basically what happens is for larger artists, they'll get name and likeness rights to actually create that merchandise. As we've learned about trademark, we can't just make merchandise for a certain band. Although you will see, parking lot t-shirt sellers at a lot of the major shows, just know that those are bootlegs. Those are not licensed merchandise. So we all sort of get the idea that we would want to have actual rights to the name and likeness from the artist in order to create official merchandise. And that's what merchandisers do. They start off with a deal for name and likeness rights. They then manufacture the goods, so the hoodies, the t-shirts, the tank tops, the visors, whatever they may be, and they handle the logistics. So oftentimes this is a drop ship situation where that just means that there's one central location where this merchandise is produced, and then it's drop shipped, meaning there's a certain amount that goes forward to each venue or festival. And so it just depends on what the tour routing is like, what the volumes are going to be like with merchandise, as to how that goes down. Sometimes it could also be just a bulk shipment sent to the artist to be physically carried around to each show on the bus or the van or whatever it may be. As you know, that's a little bit more heavy logistical responsibility on the artist, the touring manager, and whatever roadies or assistants there might be. So it depends on how big you are, how much you're going to sell, on how that manufacturing and delivery process will work. In the case of bands that are just starting out or self-managing bands, people that are at the level of learning about the music industry, we're probably more along the lines of carry your own boxes to your own show. And even in those cases, manufacturing it yourself, going online, Alibaba or something like that, and finding a manufacturer or even a local manufacturer. There's a lot of shops out there that make t-shirts and different, promotional items. So it's very easy to find this. It's more expensive per unit for you to do it this way. So let's say you're only wanting 100 t-shirts, for example, or 100 hoodies or 50, tank tops. The per unit cost is going to be a lot higher when you're doing that that way than it is with a merchandiser who's, say, making 50,000 t-shirts for your concert tour. So again, there's a lot of different levels here. We're talking more on the pop star level or the major touring act level where there is a merchandiser involved. They're actually getting these deals in place and handling things on behalf of that act. And so they'll be handling the logistics and also the sales at the shows. If you have a really big touring act, there will be included someone that's actually taking care of that merchandise and selling it or helping to interact with the in-venue team to sell that merchandise. And so let's talk a little bit more about those logistics and how the money flows in that case. And so if you are working with a merchandiser, it's almost similar to a record deal where you're earning a royalty on the sales of those items. The merchandiser needs to make a profit. Even sometimes the venue gets a cut of the profits of merchandise, depending on the deal. So if you're not getting, you know, those things worked out ahead of time with each of these parties, it's something to really pay attention to. And there are standards in the industry for how that works. And so in this case of a big act, you're working with an intermediary called a merchandiser. It's a separate deal. And then all of these things would be handled by them, and you would then get a royalty as the artist. In the case that you're manufacturing your own merchandise, handling the sales, maybe you've got a friend who's in the back of the room at a table. That's typically how we see it in the sort of newer acts and the touring of cafes and small venues. There'll be a folding table at the back of the room, oftentimes actually brought by the act themselves, maybe a banner taped across the front of it, right? This is very DIY. In the cases like that, of course, if it takes $5 to produce the t-shirt and then you're selling it for $11, you're making a $6 profit off that. And it's up to you how to split that among the band members or reinvest it, which would be probably the best thing to do, back into building the brand, building the fan base, and those types of things. So we're kind of talking on parallel levels, but in the world of merchandisers, you would then get a royalty. Let's continue talking about this world of royalties when you're talking about merchandisers, the intermediary. So usually what this is going to be is a percentage of the gross sales. Now, as we remember, there's a difference between net and gross. Gross is the money's taken in, period. So if you sell 5 t-shirts at $20 a piece, you get $100 for this gross sales number. And usually that royalty to the artist would then be back to the royalty to the artist would be taken out of that gross. And so the one thing to keep in mind is it's kind of an altered gross because you are minusing out taxes and credit card fees. I mean, it's kind of standard to do it that way. It's the income from it. So obviously you're not making the income if you're, taking the tax and the credit card fees. Usually that comes out to like a 30 to 40% of gross as the merchandise royalty for the artist. So if that makes sense. Then we want to really think about, there's oftentimes talk of, well, there's printed programs and there's souvenirs and there's wearables and all of that stuff. Usually we don't see a lot of printed programs anymore. Sometimes it just depends. Sometimes festivals will have like a festival book. So that's where that has evolved to. But a lot of the information out there about merchandise royalties will talk about printed programs, which is sort of a different royalty. For us in the modern music industry, we don't focus as much on that. So we're going to move on from that point. Just know that that's something that's out there. Now, what about the case of festival merchandise? A lot of times there'll be like a festival hoodie, right? I bet a lot of you out there have purchased a festival t-shirt or some kind of festival merchandise that shows all the bands that were there or several of the bands, or maybe it's just branded with, Coachella or Lightning in a Bottle, maybe with all the bands listed, the calendar, the artwork from, maybe the brand, the artwork from the advertising for the festival, something like that. I think we're all familiar with what those types of merchandise look like. The money flows a little bit differently for that because it's not just the individual artist and their persona and their brand that's selling that item. It's sort of the overall brand and aura of the festival in which those artists who are participating are contributing. So the brand of Coachella, for example, is not built up without the artists that they have been booking for the last, 15 years, right? And so we associate the brand desirability of these festivals and associate that with the performers. And so, of course, the performers should get some kind of a cut of merchandise sold, even if it doesn't mention their name, if it's the brand of the festival, because it makes sense that those artists are helping to sell that brand of that festival. Without those artists, those festivals wouldn't be anything. And so we do negotiate a little bit of merchandise monies based on that and based on how big of a part of that branding are you. Are you an opener on day one at noon on the smallest stage near the entrance and the porta potties? Then you may not be getting a percentage of this festival merchandise, just to be honest. I mean, people are not coming there to see little scummy pond on the backyard stage, right? They're coming there to see Beyonce, right? It becomes Beachella, at that point. And so it does depend on how much of a contribution are you making. So let's say you're one of these bands, you're a mid-tier to top-tier band at a festival, and maybe your name is included on that hoodie. Maybe your, the aura of your band and what you're contributing makes sense to garner or demand some of this merchandise money. So commonly they're going to be moving towards this profit split model. And basically what that is splitting profits with the biggest artists that may be contributing to this brand desirability. This one now, this is different from what I just said in the sort of touring, the regular sort of concert tour idea where you're selling your own merchandise sort of one-to-one, maybe working through a merchandiser. In this case, when you're doing a profit split, it does come out of net. So that just makes sense, right? Because you're splitting profit, you're not splitting revenue or gross, right? So revenue and gross are sometimes used interchangeably. This is going to be after the cost of production, which is different from when we talked about splits with net and basing royalties off of, basing royalties off of gross, like we were talking about with a normal tour. So here we're actually doing profit split, which is going to be based on net. And normally this is like 75 to 80% of net, depending on how big the artist is. So the year that Beyonce basically took over Coachella, her team probably negotiated something around this 75-80% of that festival t-shirt. It really would depend. This is like if your act is the headliner of this whole entire festival and is selling tickets, basically. You may get smaller amounts depending on how great your artist manager or your team is with negotiating it. So you would be getting, if you're a huge artist like that, 75-80% of net without the taxes and fees again. So we usually take out the credit card fees and the taxes before we calculate anything on both of those models. So, just the Because This Event t-shirts, right? And so we talked about that at the beginning of the slide. Now let's talk about hall fees. What are hall fees? So this is something that's kind of from the beginning stages of the music industry, and we still have it around today, and that's why it's called kind of hall. They used to be music halls, right? And usually this would be when the venues are supplying the staff to sell the merchandise. I know, like, for example, at Red Rocks, they have an existing venue team that takes care of all the merchandising. Normally the bands don't send people in to take care of the sales in a situation like at Red Rocks, where they have more of a professionally managed merchandise area. And it just depends on smaller festivals that I've been to. You see there's just kind of a jumble of people in a booth, and they're all from the different bands, and they kind of come in and out based on what the day and time is of the band's set times and things like that. So it can be all the way from like a person sitting in the back that tours around with the band that's like maybe somebody's significant other or family member, all the way to a professionally managed merchandise area like they would have like at a Red Rocks. And so in this case, you would need to talk about a hall fee for a venue like Red Rocks who's taking care of something like that. And usually the hall fee would be somewhere around 25% of the gross, plus you would be paying them the credit card fee, because it makes sense if they're supplying the infrastructure to make these purchases happen, they are already in charge of paying out those credit card fees, and this is basically a reimbursement for that. So just understanding that you're going to have to pay for those services of those people handling the merchandise. Usually this is in a case where it is a larger touring act. They have a merchandiser, they're playing and headlining it, a place like Red Rocks. It's these big, larger deals that we're talking about. And usually a deal with a merchandiser will limit hall fees. And so if there's a demand for a bigger hall fee than that merchandiser allows, then the artist would have to decide whether or not the merchandise opportunity is big enough for them to pay the difference in that a split with the venue. So just know that that's kind of a caveat where you need to make sure you understand what is your deal with your merchandiser. Are there limits on hall fees? And then as you're negotiating, or your merchandiser actually should be negotiating with each one of these venues. So usually this doesn't become a huge problem because the merchandiser is involved in that conversation, and they say, hey, look, our hall fee cap is 25%. Will that work for you? Yes. If the venue says we cannot sell the merchandise for anything less than 27, and your merchandiser says their limit's 25, but you think you're going to sell a heck of a lot of merchandise at that particular show, you as the artist can take on the responsibility for covering that extra 2% of the gross out of your side of the take. So it gets a little bit complicated. That's why we have artist managers. That's why we have lawyers. That's why we have merchandisers to deal with all these things for us as touring artists. Now let's talk about merchandise advances. And again, this is something that's happening kind of further along in the music career when you are working with a merchandiser who's putting up money up front to produce all of this for you. So this is something where, their cost may be returnable. So we really want to pay attention to that. So advances on merchandise royalties, they're really similar to like a publishing advance or a record label advance, where monies are paid out based on the royalties that are expected to then come back in. So you may get a royalty on your merch, like we said at the beginning of the conversation, somewhere around 30% or higher, depending on who's putting up the money for what. And so you may be able to get an advance on that, especially if you have a good track record of selling lots of merchandise on tour. Your merchandiser may give you an advance against the sales of that merchandise to be calculated out of your royalty. But the thing that's really scary about this is in the case of merchandise advances, which is a little bit different than a record label advance, usually these are returnable, or repayable is another way to say that. And so what that means is they give you a $10,000 advance. You don't sell one t-shirt and you got all these boxes and boxes of t-shirts now in your garage. Well, you still have to pay back that 10 grand of that royalty advance. So this is really scary to try to do as an artist, especially if you don't know what your merchandise sales are going to be. You may end up with a storage unit full of merch as well as a bill to pay to your merchandiser. So just be very careful in signing these types of advances. You may want to negotiate a right to repay, which means if that merchandise isn't sold, even though the merchandiser paid for it to be made, if you have a right to repay clause in your deal with that merchandiser, you have the right to then pay for that merchandise, repay the cost for what it costs to make it, get it away from that merchandiser, and sell it yourself. So that's a good clause to have in there because it protects you against them owning this merchandise and then essentially kind of owning you until everything is paid back. And if you don't have control over it, sometimes that makes people uneasy, where they would rather just have a storage unit full of tchotchkes to sell maybe on their website, for example, or give away with a purchase of the next album or something like that. So you want to negotiate a right to repay and pay attention to whether or not that advance would be deemed returnable. You want to also think about merchandiser exclusivity. And most of the time when we're working with a merchandiser, they do restrict the sales of merch around the venue that you're playing at, things like that. So we're going to get into retail merchandising here in a minute, but you do want to pay attention to this merchandiser exclusivity clause, because it restricts what you can really do, like let's say in the same city when you're touring around within a 48-hour period of that show. And it makes sense because they don't want, a $10 t-shirt to be available at the independent record store down the street. And you do, let's say you do a record signing or something like that, or an in-store the day of your concert to promote ticket sales. And then everybody's there buying your $10 t-shirt when the merchandiser is trying to sell it for 25 bucks at the show. Everybody had a chance to buy it for 10. Now you're cannibalizing their business and they don't like that. So when you're sharing in this with a merchandiser, usually you're going to have a restricted ability to sell any merch with retail, or just even out on a street corner, for example. Like you cannot sell your own merchandise within a certain geographic radius of that show. Let's say usually within 24 to 48 hours before the show, because you don't want to cannibalize their business. Usually it needs to include a clause for you to protect yourself as an artist that it would not include retail or promo giveaways. So in the example that I just gave, if you have this clause in the contract that says, okay, we're going to restrict the sales of the merch. We're not going to sit outside the venue with a table, 3 days ahead of time and sell all the merch out. But we want to be able to promote this, let's say on the radio and give away a free hoodie, or, give away tickets with a merch pack or something like that. You want to make sure that you're still able to move around and promote, that, but without cannibalizing the business for the merchandiser. So something to think about as you're negotiating these merchandise deals. Another very, very, very important thing is creative control. Something to really think about is making sure that the merchandiser can't just create whatever image they want, in whatever colors they want. And maybe it's some kind of imagery that you don't agree with politically or morally. I mean, you never know. So you want to make sure that you get artist approval on every single thing that they do, including design, the goods themselves, like how the t-shirt material feels. All that stuff matters. If you've ever been at a concert and you've bought a $20, t-shirt, or 25 or 30 nowadays, right? They're pretty expensive. And the quality is not good. Like it's scratchy and the tag scratches and it's like, it doesn't fit well, I mean, it matters. You're not excited about your purchase, and you may not think it was worth that $30 or $40. So make sure that the goods themselves you're able to approve as well. Usually manufacturing companies will give you a sample, or a series of samples where it's like, here's our cheapest t-shirt ever, here's our more expensive, 100% organic cotton, and then in between, usually they'll at least be able to give you like a swath so that you can feel it and touch it and approve what that is going to be. You also want to have creative control over photos, design rights. You just want to make sure that they're producing something that you are happy with and that your fans are going to be happy with. Now, moving to the next topic, we want to make sure that we talk about sell-off. So that's also when I was talking earlier about the right to repay or the right to buy. If your merch doesn't sell, the merchandiser can either sell it to you with the right to buy at wholesale plus 5 or 10%, so they can make a little bit of money off of it back, or they can unload it in retail. So have you guys ever been surprised to find a band or an artist's t-shirt or merchandise in like a Ross Dress for Less store or a Marshall's, right? I've been surprised. I've seen some of this stuff in there, and that's where you're seeing that they're unloading it in retail. So these retailers, they do it with all kinds of different things, not just music merchandise, of course, but somebody like Forever 21 or like a Marshalls can come in and bulk buy big lots of merchandise like this that didn't sell. And then, the thing to consider is what's the impact on your brand? Is it something that you care about to have your merchandise sold in that way? Do you want to be seeing that in like a Burlington Coat Factory discount rack? Do you not care about that? Do you just want it to be out there and it doesn't matter how people are wearing it? Obviously, the money side of it's a lot different because you're going to be selling that for like $6 rather than $26. But it's better than sitting in a warehouse making nothing and you sitting there owing the merchandiser back the production cost. So this is another clause to think about in your merchandise deal. It's called sell off. Always try to buy it back. If you think you can sell it, like on your website or as a ticket package or for your VIP Patreon fans, something like that, if you think you can sell it, buy it. If you don't think you can sell it, maybe they can, and you want to get off with as least amount owed to them as possible, but never accept a repurchase obligation. So what that means is if your merch doesn't sell, if you have a repurchase obligation in your contract, you have to buy it from them. So what if they spent $25,000 creating merchandise for this huge tour? Maybe the tour got canceled for some reason. If you have a repurchase obligation, now you have to buy that merchandise and pay for its storage and try to resell it. So one of the things we always want to look for is a repurchase obligation. We don't want that. Now let's talk a little bit about retail merchandising. So this is where we can sell some more. So how does it work? How does that retail merchandising work? Let's take a look at this because most big merchandisers, they will have sort of sub-merchandisers that handle this retail merchandising area. So if they have the sub-merchandisers, they'll be handling part of the deal and usually will receive about 15% of those sales as a fee for managing them. So if we back up a little bit, it depends on your deal, but you're probably getting around 30 to 40% of that gross income from merchandise in a normal tour situation. It's similar in the retail world where you as an artist will get around that much, but depending on whether or not there's a sub-merchandiser, the merchandisers will keep about 15% of those royalties. So it's something to look out for. And then same thing with retail as it is with touring or any other kind of merchandise. You always want to make sure that you have final approval on anything that's being created on the behalf of your band. Let's go a little bit deeper into retail merchandising royalties, figure out how the money flows. So 15 to 25% of wholesale for brick and mortar retail will go back to the artist as a royalty. When we're talking about online, it's usually 25 to 35% of that wholesale because they don't have the overhead to pay for as they would in a brick and mortar situation. The other thing that you might want to think about is investing and selling from your own website. Now, again, as I said at the beginning, this is something where you may be a smaller act or you may have the capacity, even as a large act, to have staff or a family member or even yourself, if you feel like you have time, managing the creation and selling of merchandise. There are a lot of great tools out there for e-commerce. to be able to sell online. I like to use Shopify. There are a lot of different plugins and tools that you can use. Even a Squarespace website will have e-commerce functionality depending on the package that you determine that you'd like to sign up for. So you can invest and sell your own merchandise even on a one-to-one basis where you wait for the order and then have it manufactured. It's a little bit more expensive that way, but you could kind of become this Etsy of bands where you're creating merchandise one-on-one with people. There's a lot of different ways that we can do it now, especially with the technology and manufacturing capabilities that we have to do online retail. So this is our lecture for today. I'm going to stop sharing the screen and just give you guys the video. I am grateful that you've been able to join this lecture on merchandising for artists and musicians. If you have any questions, again, throw them in the chat, and I look forward to talking more with you about other music industry topics very soon.